At the 2024 International Media Conference, much of the discussion revolved around generative AI. But the tone of discussion has changed greatly from the conversations just a year ago. One of the quotable quotes from the first day of the conference was a statement from the Filipino journalist J. Mark Tordesillas, and I quote, "The more you use AI, the more you realize how stupid it is." Isn't AI supposed to be smart? What is AI, and what is it really for anyway? Hello, I'm John Nery, and you are in the Public Square. We are on site at the Philippine International Convention Center, and we are joined today by Irene Jay Liu, Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific of the International Fund for Public Interest Media, and Nikki Usher, Assistant Professor of Communication at the University of San Diego. In two different sessions directly related to AI, Irene and Nikki offered some truly thought-provoking insights, and I'm delighted to welcome both Irene and Nikki. Thank you for joining us in the Public Square.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Let me start by referencing something that Irene said. I know that you both recognize that journalists are not the only gatekeepers anymore. You know, a truth that some old-time journalists may have a hard time accepting. As Irene said, public information is not from journalists alone. I'd like to ask, so this whole time we've been looking at journalism grappling with AI. What does journalism's grappling with AI tell us about AI itself as a phenomenon? Maybe I can start with Irene and then Nikki.
I think that AI, generative AI in particular, has forced us to really rethink what is the purpose of information and really taking a view of the user. This is something that we talked about in our panel yesterday, but the big change that we've seen since essentially the advent of the internet is that it isn't just, you know, journalists on high delivering information and saying, this is what you need to know. Users are becoming much more empowered through technology, through many platforms, about what they want to use and how they use it. And so I think that one of the changes is that back in the day, you would go to the newspaper or radio or TV for pretty much every decision you make in your life. What's going on in my school? Which grocery store has the coupon that allows me to buy at a discount? Now that's completely fragmented. However, you know, we sort of, as journalists, have thought about journalism as still being all-encompassing. And I think that more and more the definition, when we really get down to what journalism is and what the value proposition is, has to be further narrowed and defined. And I think, in my mind, you know, when we think about journalism, it should be, yes, it should be information that helps people to make decisions in their lives. That is literally the definition of public interest information. And then if you go further, journalism at its kind of ideal is holding institutions accountable. It's, you know, digging up those stories that are uncovered, and it's helping people to look outside of their own worldview and experience to understand the broader world, right? But when it comes to products and platforms and how people interact with information technology, you know, people can get all different types of information in many different places, and that has been kind of the central challenge. And I think generative AI, in the form of chatbots, in the form of kind of that conversational discussion, you're not going to suddenly be like, okay, well, I'm going to go here for the information about movie times and where, you know, and where to go to eat. But then, you know, do I go to a different chatbot and have a different conversation about news? Maybe in this future that will be the case, but I think that right now, you know, it's going to result in more consolidation.
Nikki, which aspects of AI are in sharper relief because of the problems journalism has with it?
So one of the advantages that journalism has is it's an industry that gets to talk a lot about itself.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is that the existential crisis that I think generative AI presents, and I think wrongly so to some degree, but presents to so many different industries, like is the college essay dead, right? You know, what's going to happen to white collar workers when, you know, AI can do their work for them? Journalists get to sort of speak loudly about those concerns as it reflects their own sort of industry,
That's
right?
yes.
And so, but what I think is most interesting to me is the extent to which most of us, and Irene mentioned this yesterday, most of us are already using some form of AI and some form of generative AI. And so the question is like, is the sort of advent of a democratized use and access to these tools, is that somehow like a radical sea change for how we understand how to look for information or how we trust and verify information? And I think that increasingly, as you point out, I'm leaning towards the sense that actually I'm not sure in the end, I hope this doesn't like come back to bite me, but I'm not sure that this is like this radical transformation.
Okay.
What I do think, and this is where I would push back on what you had to say, is I don't think the user is driving the show. I think the big tech companies are. And I think that now we have an added intermediary where we've got digital intermediaries of Google and Meta, and now we've got OpenAI, and we've got all these other sort of the generative AI companies as well. And so there's even more of a layer of big business over sort of that information architecture.
I want to ask a question later about this idea of the audience being reshaped or reformed by AI. Maybe we can talk about that. But I want to be clear, at least to our audience, that okay, I'm a journalist. I'm interested in AI, but I want the conversation to be about more than just journalism, right? I mean, so I'd like to ask you, how should we approach AI? Now, I mean, as I said several months ago, our very first episode on AI had a panic-stricken title, "Who's Afraid of ChatGPT?" And now, Nikki, you're saying, hey, maybe it's not as radical as people might think. And I think the case might start to be made for that. I mean, the more people use AI, it's like, okay, it's very powerful, but it's not all powerful, that sort of thing. So I'd like to ask both of you, again, Irene first and then Nikki, how should we think about this? I mean, not just for journalists, but for everyone who's going to use AI.
I think for generative AI, currently, we should view it as a tool. It is going to be an increasingly powerful tool that will actually help with a lot of perhaps more mundane tasks, right? So copy editing. Back in the day, people had to know how to spell everything perfectly. Now you have spell check. No one even thinks twice about that. You have grammar check. This is sort of the next level. I think that there is some question to be had about whether or not it makes everyone write exactly in the same way, which becomes boring. That's a different piece. But I think that it can be very useful for many newsrooms and for many journalists in their day-to-day transcription, summarizing, long articles to short articles. There are all kinds of things that this could be very helpful for. I think, and this speaks to what Nikki said, which is how this will affect the connection between the person who's producing content and information and how it eventually reaches the user, the audience, the person who's using that information in their daily lives. There are going to be many intermediaries. And so I think that on the one hand, separating the different issues. There's how do you use the tool? What are the ethics around using the tool? What is required for disclosure? Those are all things that I think many newsrooms are grappling with and many industry organizations are also thinking about, building standards around it. To me, and this is an area that I spend a lot of time thinking about and working on, is what about the impact on the whole information ecosystem, particularly around how journalism or the production of information is going to be funded in the future. And I look at it in two ways. One is it's an opportunity because those who are in the business of translating the real world and what we see into ones and zeros that will be ingested by the large language models or as grounding data or in kind of the product, that's going to be a very important activity. And because language and culture are so important in how that translates to the user, I think there's an opportunity for those who are in the business of understanding culture and understanding and writing in language it's going to be very powerful and important. I think the question though is whether or not there will be a sustainable business model around that. Who profits and who benefits from that work, right? And journalism in many places is costly because you need humans to actually do that translation from the real world to the digital world. And when we're talking about licensing and all these other issues, there's a big question about who's going to get the payout. And I just want to raise one other point, because I think for the nerdy journalists who are listening to this or watching this, I think a lot of kind of optimists will say, well, this is going to open up so many opportunities because suddenly all these school records and public documents and everything, you can use generative AI to help unpack it. But guess what's going to happen? We have had a good 15 years of an open data movement. If suddenly there are tools available to translate that into accountability reporting, guess what's going to be the first thing that suddenly is no longer online and no longer freely available? In institutions that do not want this stuff easily uncovered will make it harder. And so we may see ourselves moving backwards in certain places around that.
Yeah, I mean, I think speaking from a U.S. context, because that's the context I know most, we have public records laws that would probably prohibit some of that. And I think one of the most innovative spaces, and this is, it kills me to say this, but where we're seeing some of the best use of public records for AI-generated journalism is actually right-wing Republican local news sites that are regurgitating public records and then saying, the restaurant reports from this small town, and doing it automatic with it using AI. And they've actually made sort of some of the biggest gains in terms of what we see that AI might be able to do for local journalism. And I think that has remained sort of something that people don't really want to talk about. People would rather dismiss this as like pink slime journalism, but amidst all of this sort of like deceptive partisanship, there's also some like, automated local journalism that is fact-based in documents. But I want to come back to your question though about like, what about everybody who isn't a journalist, right? And I think that there's the value proposition for journalism increasingly, and my book, my last book is called News for the Rich, White, and Blue, How Place and Power Distort American Journalism. And so the value proposition of who's going to pay for news and what that news looks like is very much not sort of like the local news, the local high school sports, like what is happening at a level of sort of there isn't a large enough market to support the news, right? And so that's where you start to see people that are going to kind of, they've already begun picking up the slack for news organizations. And what'll be most interesting will be to see how ordinary people who are trying to give information to their community end up using these tools. We make a lot of jokes in the United States about like, what's the school board gonna do? Who's gonna cover like the county police or the county courts, right? And right now we see a lot of that falling to ordinary people who are just sort of like in these meeting rooms, in these public spaces, trying to get the information out to people, whether that be through posting on Facebook or whether that be through their own sort of microblog or just, and I think that that's gonna become something that they may be able to do more efficiently through some of these AI tools as they develop. So I think, hold your seat and see what happens, because people are creative and ultimately these tools have no meaning except for how we decide to employ them. And I do think that there are ways in which these tools can help make up for some of the deficits that exist in reporting, in helping people who aren't journalists do this.
Can I jump in on that?
Oh yeah, of course.
I think that it's an interesting question, because I think that, one of the beautiful parts about the advent of the internet and social media was the fact that you had citizens who were committing journalistic acts.
Right.
And I think that, there are many technologists who still believe in that, and they would, much rather, call social media and Reddit and other, places for information because they don't have to pay for it. But I think the challenge is there's a constant question for technology companies, for governments, and for anyone, is that someone has to decide what is authoritative and what isn't authoritative, right? And everyone sort of doesn't want to be the one to be responsible for that decision. Tech companies don't want to. They don't want to pick and choose and be the arbiter of truth. Governments, some of them want to, but then actually citizens don't want government. They don't trust government to be that arbiter, right? And I think that this is a central challenge for where we go with this, because as we move more and more into relying on AI mediated spaces for information, you know, someone is going to have to make that decision. What do you raise up? What do you lower? Right? There was a difference when, you know, you kind of went to Google search or to Bing search or any search engine, and it was just a bunch of links, because ultimately you could kind of keep scrolling and click on the link and keep clicking on links. If suddenly people are relying on a summary and they don't know where the sources are and they don't go to different links, then suddenly that, whatever is that summary, the importance of authoritativeness becomes really important. So someone has to own that and someone has to be responsible for it.
Yeah, sorry, I just go ahead, John.
Go ahead, no, go ahead.
I mean, I think that
I'm just here taking notes.
If there's one major change that I think people aren't talking enough about, it's about the end of the link-based internet system. Like, we have had the end of the link-based, right? Like, if you
which
start,
explains Google's dominance.
yeah, I know exactly the right. Like, Google's entire, it was like a page rank system, right? And you are suggested a number of links, but when you are no longer linking out because the content of your answer is already there, then you've kind of eroded the essential networking structure of the internet. And so this is why it's so critical for news organizations and so threatening, is that when there is a summary, there's no need to go beyond the summary. And you know, I think a lot about Google News, which this fight over like the news snippet, and at the very beginning of Google News, Google was like taking, you know, little snippets, and then, but there was always a link back, right? Now there's no more link back. And so the fundamental way in which we imagine an open internet to some degree is threatened, I think, by sort of the summative nature of generative AI and prompting.
Yes. Candidly, I've changed my search engine. I've given up on Google. So my choice of toxic billionaire now is Bill Gates. So I'm using Bing. But it is true. A lot of the results I get, I can read everything right on the search results page. I don't need to go there. I want to go back to that idea of, like, so how does that affect the profitability, for instance, of news organizations, and also this whole idea about who profits from AI. But first, I want to go back to the question of framework. The communication scholar David Hesman-Hogg talks about, you know, the cycles of digital evolution. So in the beginning, we had this sense of digital optimism, right? The internet will solve everything. Everyone becomes a publisher. But of course...
Wait, it hasn't? Sorry.
You didn't get the news? What I want to ask you is, did we learn anything from the first few cycles of, you know, the life of the evolution of the internet, which we can apply to how we deal with AI? I mean, like, this whole idea that, hey, I'm a single newsroom in Mindanao and I can, you know, compete with Rappler. The barriers to entry are actually very, very high, right? I mean, it can't all be solved by AI, right? So,
I mean, the reason that David's work is so resonant is because he's identified sort of this ongoing sort of structure in how we talk about technology. And fundamentally, the way that we talk about technology hasn't really changed. When we have a new piece of technology, the sort of power dimensions in society are litigated through our fears and our hopes for that technology. And so I think if we have learned anything about kind of what might guide us from the before, is that technologies are not going to alone challenge systems of governance and power. There's like the Arab Spring. If the Arab Spring taught us anything, it's that Twitter isn't going to bring democracy to the world, and that it's really fundamentally about how we use this technology. And I think the other thing is, I think that we maybe didn't anticipate that we've always thought that like more information is better. Right, that the best information will rise to the top, and we have seen
good information drives up bad. That's our thing.
And the implosion of sort of like this idea of the marketplace of information with good information rising to the top. It's like, no, the loudest, the information that's best able to manipulate sort of algorithmic curation in order to be surfaced, right?
Most engaging,
and that can be complete bunk, right? That's what. So that the idea of an informed democracy through a digital sort of universe, it scares me that I have to say that's not a reality. But hopefully I'm wrong.
I have hope that we can learn from, Web 1 through 3, I guess, so you can say it. To me, the opportunity is the fact that in this new world, local, timely information is going to be very important, right? In fact, thus far, the biggest players have been the ones who are in the best position to benefit from the advent of the internet. When I talk about news organizations, right? But what happens when suddenly you say, okay, I need, I'm building a product, I have an LLM. You don't need 4 versions necessarily of the same story covering the same press conference on a national level. Actually, what will matter in terms of the quality to prevent hallucinations and others is, do you have the breadth of information across geographies, to really go down to the local level so that, I'm living someplace. I mean, it's kind of this adage of local news being incredibly important, right? I think that the challenge is that the funding mechanisms for journalism haven't changed, and what news organizations and the industry as a whole has not learned yet is that you can't go in alone and try to get a bigger, better deal unless you're the biggest players. Where there needs to be more discussion is around collaboration, and not just around negotiating deals with big tech. Sure. It's potentially taking advantage of the opportunity to actually build your own products. I mean, people talk about open source LLMs and other things, right? But there's a world where organizations, smaller startups will leverage the LLMs that are being built by OpenAI and by Google and other places, and then build products for specific audiences.
See, I wish I could buy that, but I don't. And the reason I don't buy that is because there was this era in which every news organization was going to build their own ad tech stack, and that if you had or they were going to build their own content management systems. Vox in the U.S. developed a system called Chorus, right? And
or the Washington Post, right, had its own OS which it was selling to others. Yeah.
Right. So then this part of, what was it called? There's it started with a Z. It was there was also sort of an effort in the U.S. to build sort of a public media appropriate tech stack, and all of those are sort of taken out of the system by the dominance of the corporate players, right? So you need to run Google's ad tech in order for your sites to actually gain any of that advertising in any meaningful way. As you pointed out yesterday, if you want your site to be indexed, you actually have to, if you want to exist in the universe, you have to have your site indexed on Google, right? And that puts you sort of under the hair of big tech. So while I like this idea of companies being able to innovate on their own and sort of collaborate,
maybe just a few.
Maybe just but I think
big player.
So but I think that there's a difference between expecting them to build these big LLMs or using. We saw in examples. Smaller newsrooms. Just individuals are able to use, GPT and others.
Yeah, sure. You can build a chat bot, or you can build it, you can customize. I think that will be sort of one of the ways that we see people coming up with the most innovative uses is specifically coming up with a locally specific way of getting information about X politician doing X thing, right? So I do think you're absolutely right. But in terms of owning the underlying tech infrastructure, if you build it, I don't think they will come, because ultimately the big tech companies are just better and more dominant.
No, I don't disagree with you on that. I think that, to me, where I'm looking at is essentially, ultimately, you need this authoritative, timely information. And so the question is, can the producers of this timely locally relevant, culturally understood information come together? And then, it requires a level of coordination, because one individual organization will not be able to do this on their own. Sure. They can try. A Bloomberg can use its huge database of financial data and reportage to build a chatbot in their own ecosystem. They can definitely do that.
They have.
And they have, right? They have a captive audience. They have enough volume, right? But can the Philippines, can even a Rappler or a GMA do that on their own data set? They could, but who's going to be the audience. The value is if everyone really comes together and says, listen, we are building a product. And this is also where I think, the question about regulation, engagement with tech companies, engagement with government comes into play, because I think that if the hope is that this will be regulated, it's going to be slow, it's going to be hard, and honestly, governments are in a tricky spot, because on the one hand, they want to get a piece of this pie, right? They want to become hubs of generative AI and AI companies. So on the one hand, they're trying to attract this kind of investment and talent and foster it by creating a more open environment. And then on the other hand, they want to be kind of protective of the implications for mis and disinformation, information integrity, and then also those noisy journalists and news organizations that keep asking for compensation, right? So those interests are at odds with each other, and so I think that the more that information producers, not just journalists, not just news organizations, but more broadly, come together and speak in one voice about what they want and what they think is needed, and also come with solutions, the more likelihood that they have a chance to be able to engage and help to shape what this looks like, instead of being just like victims of unintended consequences.
So it turns out that much of the discussion about AI should actually involve money, funding, resources, right? I mean, you said yesterday, you pointed out that for someone, maybe $50 is a small thing, but for some newsrooms, they can't even subscribe to the $20 subscription fee for Chat GPT for one person, right? I mean, so we'll get back to that. But I want to ask, at this point, I want to ask you, can we opt out? Say I'm a teacher, I'm an advertising agency creative. Can I say I don't want to have anything to do with AI?
I mean, so it's interesting because we see this in higher ed, right? I'm a professor, and there are professors who are adamantly, they're putting on the top of their syllabus, no generative AI, no AI being used. But then when you think about, like, we have a lot of students that are not working in English as a first language, right? And so actually Grammarly, which is like a grammar check, right? Actually helps kind of get rid of those stupid sort of like silly errors that we would knock a student down for a grade or two, right? Unfortunately, when you feed an essay that's used Grammarly into like, is it AI or is it not, it will almost always flag it, right? And because it's a little bit more, it's like perfectly mechanistic, like it's actually good grammar as opposed to the kind of intuitive grammar that you have as a sort of native speaker. And so, but I've kind of come around to realizing, again, it's all about choice, right? And it's all about understanding and actively, like, what are your options for using this technology? What is an ethical decision for you? What is an ethical decision for the people you have in your life? And ultimately, how can you use these tools in ways that just enhance what you're already doing? So I think opting out is sort of like the next person's like, oh, I don't want to be on social media. I don't do that, right? But you know what? Every time you've had a picture taken of you and your friends tagged you, you are on social media, right? And so the tentacles of this technology are going to reach beyond far what you as you can't opt out, but you can also make good choices when you are in that situation.
So you think AI is an octopus with tentacles?
I think that if you are online at all, if you use a computer at all, you're using these technologies, right? And more you will increasingly be using them in sort of invisible ways, right? And so I think that you really can't opt out unless you want to go live in the woods and write pen to paper, I guess. But you probably will have a lot of grammar and spelling errors, right? I think that, to be honest, it's a disservice to anyone really, especially those who are looking to kind of go into the real world and start working, to not engage with these questions and not make them aware, because this is the world we're going to be in. And I mean, it's interesting because the higher ed question is a really interesting one, because I think, what I'm seeing is that this is requiring a reflection for every industry about what it is actually that what are you paying people to do, and what is the value, right? Because one of the things that I think about in terms of this new world where you can suddenly have an assistant that helps you write beautiful prose is that back in the day, a lot of journalists were high school graduates, maybe not even, they were copy kids that then suddenly rose up and became editors, right? Over the past 20, 30 years, we've seen a professionalization of journalism to the detriment, quite frankly, I think, of the industry and also, connections with different, kind of our readers and our audiences. There's a new world now where you could say, listen, like, we don't care whether you write beautiful prose. Are you nosy? Are you good at, are you a good gossip? Are you able to get stuff out of people? And suddenly, all those scoop machines that can kind of go into a community and build trust and get all that information, suddenly they can put notes in, and then, you have pretty good prose that then an editor will look over. I mean, there's a world where this becomes actually a tool to help more people and more diversity in the information gathering. I think to your point also about citizen journalists. But it's a question of having to really think through, like, what are we trying to do with the tool, and what are we trying to avoid by not using the tool?
This reminds me of the discussion in one of your sessions about having AI anchors or hosts, right? I mean, and somebody said it's not a successful experiment and so on, and then I think it was Irene who said, but do you have Alexa or Siri and so on, and who knows, that might be for the younger generation like a credible source of information. And I thought that question actually gives us an example of the kind of questioning you should start when it comes to dealing with AI, right? So it's like, is a human person reading the news a necessary part of journalism, right? I mean, do I need the? Well, can it be like what was his Max Headroom? I don't know if you're.
But I don't know what that. Yeah, sorry, I'm missing that reference.
So that's from the 1980s, MTV and that sort of thing. So they have this robotic image, that says things and so on. Anyway, the point is that do you need a human person to read the news? My point is that asking a question like that makes you wonder, really, what is AI for? And then maybe we can find what really is the essence of journalism or teaching or ad agency work or whatever.
But I mean, I think the question you're asking is fundamentally what makes humanity special, right? And that is sort of like, it isn't a new question, right? This is a question that has sort of like been part of philosophy, part of like, but I think it's forcing us to ask, for everybody to ask it. It's not just the domain of the philosopher, but like, why is it that I like having an anchor that I connect with and believe in, and that I see, I have a crush on Anderson Cooper. I would like, I could teach, and then and I because of the way that he delivers content and the connections he's able to make. But there are currently AI newsreaders in lots of places, and not just China, but also the BBC developed a newsreader for weather or something. Anything you can use structured data is, it's especially useful for. And so it's like, what is it about that news anchor that we need? And I think for me, it's like comfort and guidance and a sense of like human connection.
Or assurance, yeah.
Yeah, and so but again, there are also questions around equity that are built in. And so I always like to point out, like, why is you can change Alexa's name, right? You can change Siri's name. Why are these, you can change Cortana. Why are these all women that you're like asking things for? Alexa, order me a Tide Pod, right? Like, and so like deconstructing, like, this all seems naturalized, but understanding that there's another question to ask is also really important too.
That's a great point, actually. We should just call it Jeeves or. I want to go back to the point about money. You raised a question earlier about who profits from this and from AI, and you're looking at, let's look at Nvidia. I mean, amazingly, out of the blue, for a time it was the most valuable company in the world in terms of the stock market, right? So over $3 trillion, and then it lost something like, I don't know, several $100 billion and so forth. I mean, that's crazy. And then Sam Altman wants to raise $7 trillion venture capital. I mean, the scale is so mind-boggling. It actually, that's the one that actually puts fear of God in me as far as AI is concerned. That you need that kind of money, the scale that's involved, and it's, Western companies or that sort of thing. How do we make sense of, the valuation, the business models here?
I mean, what would be amazing is if, since we know that information is going to be key to the value of any of these technologies, if suddenly there was I think that we need to have a rethinking of how information is produced and valued and where it is. And it's not just the bigger players who produce the most words or the most photos and the most video that will get the most compensation, right? I think that we need to, there needs to be a new resetting of how we're valuing all of this, because also there's where quality becomes important. But again, someone needs to decide and create standards, and this is actually, I think, one of the conversations that kind of the news industry or the information industry really needs to think through is not allowing market forces to be the sole determining factor of how this production is compensated. If we think that information is a public good, which I think it is, you need it to have functioning societies, then we need to rethink how this is being compensated. There's a world where potentially you could think through, I don't know, maybe for all these companies that have huge valuations and kind of are also benefiting from this. Like, can you imagine if there was some mechanism for, shares to be part of a kind of endowment around supporting information? I mean, again, this is all very hypothetical, but like I think looking at the linkages and really thinking through and completely not making assumptions about how that the current market is funding this and kind of rethinking it. I mean, and there are many people who think about, okay, what about a tax? What about this? What about that? I think that, I would like us to see how we look beyond even nation state borders, because the reality is that, there is more money in the West, in, high income countries, and yet they still have problems with funding quality journalism in their local constituencies. So, this will require a complete rethinking, and I think my hope is that the news industry starts really getting into it and tackling the questions and not just kind of waiting for someone else to solve it for them.
Okay.
I mean, I think that we see this, there's a precedent for which the news industry missed the boat, and it's in the way in which there are no real standards on the internet for how ads are valued and how attention is counted. And there's tremendous ad fraud, and the news industry lost billions and billions of dollars by not really kind of setting standards for how we understand sort of the digital attention economy. To that end, like, these numbers, these huge valuations, they just feel like funny money, like you're kind of like on air or on sand or some, and that really bothers me because there are real material consequences. The first thing I think we're not talking nearly enough about is for all of that valuation of what this technology is worth, what is the actual devaluation to our environment, because all of this AI, generative AI, all of this computation requires more and more natural resources, more and more water at a time when we're seeing issues around basic rare earth metals, right? Like, and so we keep forgetting that there are material consequences for these kind of like information situations, or sort of this information environment. And I think the thing that we really need to talk about is we are constantly as people being seen as consumers. There are very few spaces where you can escape being targeted for your attention. And the thing is that none of these companies are ever sort of like, those companies don't get taxed, or they're getting this all for free. Right? They're getting our attention for free to help further monetize their own goals. And I want to figure out how we carve back that space where we aren't always viewed as consumers, where we aren't constantly tracked, and where companies are held accountable for getting all of that for free from us.
The tension on the other side, though, is that I think for many places in many markets where it is resource poor in terms of salaries, in terms of, just like, the income per capita, right? Attention is the way that you still get access to this information. And I think that this is a fundamental challenge that we face with even something as simple as, charging subscriptions or reader revenue, right? I mean, to the point of your book, right? I mean, it's just, is high quality information now suddenly only going to be, is it something that is only for the elite? And when we say elite within one country, one market, or elite globally, right? That only the high income in high income countries will be able to access this information, and then everyone else will just have to deal with the, kind of drivel that is produced by content farms and others who have a different way of monetizing. And this is going to be, I think that this tension is only going to be exacerbated as people move into more AI-mediated spaces.
Maybe, Nikki, part of the answer to your question, or maybe I hope part of the answer is we learn to puncture the myth of the marketplace as the source of value. So even when it comes to ideas, right? I mean, the very well written passage by Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. talking about the test of an idea is how it's accepted in the marketplace of ideas and so on, and it sounds so nice, but I think that, I don't know, maybe it just puts too much of a premium on the market.
Well, I mean, I think the fundamental misreading of Adam Smith is that the markets are imagined as being regulated so that they can be functionally competitive, right? And when we think about ideas, something that we've had to acknowledge is that not everybody has the same access to put their ideas forward or the same ability to kind of like shape the conversation. And so the whole fundamental premise of like the best ideas rising to the top is like the best ideas of the most powerful people.
That's right.
Right. And now they're not even biggest, but now they're not even the best ideas. Some of these are like the worst memes and the worst misinformation, right?
That's right.
So
I just want to, we don't have time. I mean, I have one more question for each of you, but I just want to note that this point that you raised about asymmetry was very much a theme of the two sessions that you were part of, right? I mean, it's like, in the beginning, in the internet, we all thought it would decentralize power, and yet, look, it's consolidated power in like 5 companies in the US, maybe 2 or 3 in China. I mean, so I just wanted to note that a lot of the time was spent talking about asymmetry. I'd like to use the last few minutes that we have to ask you a question that I wanted to ask in the sessions, but I wasn't able to. Nikki, in your Substack, you asked a truly provocative but also foundational question. How do we know, you asked, how do we know that journalism has made democracy better? And then I just want to ask, how does AI complicate or resolve that question of yours?
I mean, this is a question some people spend a lifetime thinking about.
Yeah.
But I think that like, what does our end goal look like, right? In terms of like, what do we want to see the world look like? And by that, I mean, like, do we want everybody able to vote? Do we want everybody to have a basic income? Do we what is the imagined world that we have that we're all fighting for? It may be different for different people, right? And where does journalism fit in? Is journalism an advocate? Is journalism a conveyor of information, right? And I think that until we have like an answer of like, what is the end to which all of this journalism is for, like something concrete that's more than just fuzzy ideals, I think it's really hard to assess like the value that it provides to society. And maybe that's a kind of mean thing to say, but I want to know, when you say journalism checks corruption, what does that mean? What does checking corruption look like? What is the end point for knowing we no longer have corruption, or like how do we declare success, right? I think AI complicates some of this because AI throws just more actors into the system, and it becomes harder to disentangle sort of causality between sort of an action happens in the world and who is responsible. So I think that's kind of the short answer.
All right. Although in the Philippines, I do have the vantage point of having lived through a dictatorship.
Yes.
And then, waking up one day and they're gone. So you can see the difference, right? But that's not the case for everyone. Irene, my question for you is, yesterday you spoke of the increasing weaponization of skepticism, which I thought was, the skeptical part, I thought that was a good thing, right? What do you mean by that? And how does AI, again, complicate or resolve that issue?
I mean, I think that overall, we've seen in so many studies that globally trust in institutions has fallen. I mean, it's everything from, the church, religious institutions, governments, education systems, and also news organizations, right? I mean, there just isn't that sort of trust. At the same time, I think that, especially in the information space, before there used to be brands that people could actually associate to either trust or distrust. And I think that in many of these spaces now, we actually, people don't even know where the information comes from. So they don't necessarily have a point of view on trusting or not trusting. But one thing we have seen is that there is more awareness about mis and disinformation, about the fact that you can't trust everything that you see. But has that actually created a more discerning audience that will seek out high quality information? I think in some cases it's true, but there are many people who just kind of throw their hands up in the air and say, well, I don't trust anything. You're all liars. And I'm only going to trust people, my friends and family. I'm only going to trust the influencers or the personalities that kind of I feel a connection to, right? And this kind of amorphous institution that's a brand name for a news organization, I don't know if I trust them. Like, people will revert to their kind of human trust. And I think that there's been a lot of discussion when it comes to deep fakes and generative AI. Well, are people gonna now trust even less, right? And I think that for those who are bad actors, now you can call things that are true fake news, and people will actually believe that it's fake news too. I think that and also then you have things that are I just think that more and more, because people don't trust anything, then suddenly you can just weaponize everyone's skepticism and say, well, yeah, don't believe in anything, but believe in me.
Well, skepticism becomes cynicism, right?
Exactly.
Irene Jay Liu and Nikki Usher, thank you. This has been a most fascinating, philosophical, enlightening conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's it for us today. The next step for engaged citizens, as always, is to take a more active part in rebuilding our democracy. You can download the Rappler Communities app and join the Everyday Tech chat room if you want to talk more about AI. Thank you. This is John Nery. See you in the public square.